Hi, I'm your host, Michael Fox. Two things I want to say before we get started. First, today's episode is part 2 of episode 7, where we look at the 2009 US-backed coup in Honduras. We ended up breaking this episode into 2 parts because there's just so much to dig into. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, I suggest you go back and do that first. It'll set the scene for everything we dive into today. Second, many portions of today's episode deal with harsh themes from the years following the 2009 coup in Honduras. If you're sensitive to this or you're in the room with small children, you might want to consider another time to listen. Okay, here's the show. So the Brazilian embassy is down this side street in this residential neighborhood, kind of in northern Tegucigalpa. You can tell that this is a spot with many embassies here because literally the street just adjacent to it is the Republic of Panama. And this one, we've got Balboa Street, but on my Google Maps it actually says Brazil Street. And then these 2-story buildings kind of go back. It's behind this gate, so it almost looks like a gated neighborhood. It's tree-lined streets, pretty quaint. You can tell this has been kind of an upscale section of Tegucigalpa for a long time. Cars rumble back and forth. There's a Chinese restaurant right here. I can actually smell the Chinese food from where I'm standing, just half a block away from the Brazilian embassy behind this fence. And it was here that Manuel Zelaya was holed up for months. 4 months total. Back in late 2009, there was a constant line of state security forces outside the embassy. Meanwhile, Zelaya, his wife Xiomara Castro, and one of their daughters lived in the cramped 2-story home alongside 4 dozen embassy workers. It's really wild being here because a lot of the different episodes that I've been working on are things that happened way in the past. But right here, 2009 was the coup against Manuel Zelaya. I remember this moment. I was following what was happening very, very closely from Brazil. Had friends on the ground. And so it's really strange to be here now and to see this up close and to be thinking of this as history because it's so present. It's still so present, right? Zelaya arrived at the Brazilian embassy in September 2009, returning from exile in Costa Rica. The calculation at the time was that Zelaya's return would keep the spotlight on Honduras and on the internationally condemned coup that removed him from power 3 months earlier. Remember, as we looked at in the first part of this episode, the military put Zelaya on a plane out of the country in June 2009 after he planned a poll to see if voters wanted to hold a referendum on whether or not to rewrite the Honduran constitution. Elites, including leaders in the National Congress and the Supreme Court, accused him of trying to unconstitutionally remain in power for another term. In the weeks and months after his ouster, Zelaya repeatedly attempted to return to Honduras. He tried to fly in. He tried to walk across the Nicaraguan border. Each time, his return was thwarted by the de facto government. But in September, he was finally secretly ferried into the country and welcomed at the Brazilian embassy in Tegucigalpa. His presence was a sign of the Honduran people's continued resistance against his ouster, proof that they would not be silent. Apart from the US and Canadian governments, the international community remained unanimously against the country's de facto regime. It seemed for a moment like there might even be a way for Zelaya to return to power. Karen Spring arrived in Honduras around this time, working with the US and Canada-based human rights group Rights Action. I spoke with her in part 1 of this episode.
It's sort of, this time where there's a lot of hope in the air because there's all these, this social mobilization. There's all these people that are excited. I think we can overturn this coup.
But Honduran elites and the US and Canadian governments had a plan to turn the tide in their favor. That in a minute. This is Under the Shadow, a new investigative narrative podcast series that walks back in time to tell the story of the past by visiting momentous places in the present. This podcast is a co-production in partnership with The Real News and NACLA. I'm your host, Michael Fox, longtime radio reporter, editor, journalist, the producer and host of the podcast Brazil on Fire. I've spent the better part of the last 20 years in Latin America. I've seen firsthand the role of the U.S. government abroad, and most often, sadly, it is not for the better. Invasions, coups, sanctions, support for authoritarian regimes. Politically and economically, the United States has cast a long shadow over Latin America for the past 200 years. In each episode in this series, I will take you to a location where something historic happened, a landmark of revolutionary struggle or foreign intervention. Today, it might look like a random street corner, a church, a mall, a monument, or a museum. But every place I'm going to bring you was once the site of history-making events that shook countries, impacted lives, and left deep marks on the world. I'll try to discover what lingers of that history today. So this is part 2 of episode 7, which looks at the fallout of the 2009 coup in Honduras. In the first half of this episode, we looked at the U.S.-backed coup d'etat against President Manuel Zelaya and the popular resistance in the streets in the immediate aftermath. In this episode, we walk from 2009 into the present. I look at the fraudulent U.S.-backed elections that ushered in a narco-dictatorship and also the resistance movement that, after years of struggle, ultimately did what it set out to do: remove the dictatorship and return democracy to Honduras. This is Under the Shadow, Season 1, Central America, Episode 7, Part 2, 2009 Honduras, Legacy of a Coup. It's September 2009. Zelaya has just arrived at the Brazilian embassy, and the Honduran de facto government rolls out a plan to hold previously scheduled elections that November. For coup President Roberto Michelledi and the United States and Canada, this is their way to wipe the slate clean, to whitewash the memory of the coup, and to pretend like they're turning a new democratic page. You'll note that I mentioned Canada often in this episode, and that's because Canada would take an active role in backing the coup regime, following lockstep behind the United States. In the years after the coup, Canadian companies and investors benefited from a new free trade agreement between the two countries, a new mining code the Canadian embassy helped to shape, and a new tourism bonanza on the Caribbean coast. None of that was a coincidence.
Cada lugar que vamos, encontramos.
Porfirio, better known as Pepe Lobo, is the candidate of the coup regime. He'd lost to Zelaya 4 years before. That's him speaking at his campaign launch. Behind him, a big blue banner hangs with the words, "Change Now," emblazoned in Spanish.
But on the ground, there was absolutely no sign of an election happening.
That's Jesse Freeston. He's a Canadian filmmaker who at the time was reporting for The Real News from Honduras. We heard from him often in the first part of this episode.
There was military in control of the streets, oppressing a movement, trying to overthrow a coup d'etat. And on the day of the election, there was almost nobody voting. And I and others uncovered evidence that they had completely fudged the numbers of how many people voted. And this was used to launder the coup. And in this, we saw a new formula for how to overthrow a government in a more representable way. So they basically hand over power from Michelleti to Pepe Lobo, but nothing changes on the ground.
The United States and Canada immediately recognized the results. The day Pepe Lobo takes office, Zelaya leaves the Brazilian embassy and goes into exile with his family in the Dominican Republic.
A few days after the election, with the military still in power in the streets and a coup d'etat having been executed successfully, the New York Times editorial board put out an unsigned opinion piece that began with the sentence, "There is wide agreement that last week's presidential election in Honduras was clean and fair."
The protests and the resistance continued, as did the violence and the government crackdown. 6 months into the Pepe Lobo administration, Berto Oliva's group COFADE, the Committee of Family Members of the Detained and Disappeared, released a report which documented more than 1,000 serious human rights violations committed by the Lobo administration or under its watch. Included in that figure were hundreds of illegal detentions and threats, as well as kidnappings, forced displacement, and raids without a warrant. More than 170 people were forced to flee the country. According to COFADE's tally, in the first 6 months of Lobo's term, there were 42 politically motivated killings in the country. That figure was higher than in the 6 months after the coup, and it included more journalists, members of the LGBTQ community, campesino activists, and other social leaders. The elections gave the illusion of a democracy, but many in Honduras called the Lobo government a continuation of the coup regime.
Basically, the story that was told was, okay, there's a Micheletti and Zelaya are both out of the picture. There's this new guy, Pepe Lobo, and governments like Canada signed a free trade agreement with the regime, and everything is back to normal, reestablishing some of the little amounts of aid that were cut, and we're all going back to normal. Meanwhile, on the ground, the Coup-ism project went into hyperspeed.
New mega-tourism projects, the reopening of mining concessions, the wholesale sell-off of the country. Not to mention a whole new level of embezzlement and widespread corruption.
So we saw corruption scandals in the years that followed that would make Enron blush.
Las cuentas simplemente no cuadran en las finanzas de la seguridad social de Honduras.
$300 million taken directly out of Honduran Social Security Medicaid type fund that helps people get access to medical services. This money, in part, went directly to fund the National Party's election campaign, and most of it was just put directly into pockets of officials. They actually even have the checks to show that it went directly into their pockets.
Anthropologist Adrian Pine says the moment that best symbolized the neoliberal priorities of the post-coup administrations was a conference held in May 2011 in the Honduran city of San Pedro Sula. It was called, in English, Honduras is open for business.
And of course, what they meant by Honduras is open for business was that, we're selling ourselves off.
Esta es una nueva época para Honduras.
This is a new era for Honduras, said Juan Orlando Hernandez, the head of the National Congress, during his speech. The top interest of the Honduran state is to foment growth and development of investment.
We'll sell you water rights, we'll sell to foreign companies land rights, we'll give away the land that indigenous communities and campesino collectives hold. We will even allow you to establish mini sovereign nations, which are now called sedes, which have been an initiative of people like Peter Thiel and the sort of libertarian fascist movement from Silicon Valley.
They sold off and they cracked down. Alex Main is the director of international policy at CEPR, the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, D.C. We heard from him in part one of this episode.
In the governments that followed, for many years, the U.S. basically ignored those human rights violations, ignored corruption, ignored also enormous irregularities in elections that took place. What counted first and foremost was to have a government that could be relied on from a strategic point of view.
Well, it's a pleasure to welcome President Lobo to the White House, and this gives us an opportunity to reaffirm the friendship between the American and the Honduran people.
Military support from the United States only increased. In March 2010, the Obama administration restored nearly $40 million in aid to Honduras that had been suspended following the coup. In 2011, almost 2/3 of all Defense Department funds for Central America went to Honduras. Those on the streets continued to fight. Journalist Felix Molina, who we heard from in the first part of this episode, continued to travel across the country, covering the resistance on his radio show. The movement even spawned a political party, Libre, Freedom and Refoundation. They organized around the key demand of holding a constituent assembly to rewrite the Constitution and refound Honduras. exactly what the military and elites had removed Zelaya for trying to do in 2009. 4 years after the coup, Xiomara Castro, the wife of ousted President Zelaya, would run for president with the Libre Party. There were violent repercussions. Nearly 20 candidates and pre-candidates of the party were killed leading up to the 2013 vote. Unlike in 2009, when the post-coup elections were widely boycotted, this time people went out to vote. But election fraud and state violence sealed the deal for the U.S.-backed candidate, Congress President Juan Orlando Hernández of Pepe Lobo's National Party.
Prometo ser fiel a la República.
I promise to be faithful to the country, he said on the day of his inauguration, to abide by the Constitution and its laws. Meanwhile, people protested on the streets. Juan Orlando Hernández came from a coffee family in western Honduras, one of 17 children, and he was a cherished ally for the United States, Canada, and other Western countries. Meanwhile, at home, he took control of all branches of government. As the head of Congress, he led a technical coup to take control of the Supreme Court, stacking it with his people. As president, he installed what eventually became known as a narco-dictatorship, with the help of his younger brother, Congressman Tony Hernández. The U.S. supported him all the way. Jesse Freeston.
This is the man who then, for almost a decade, shook hands with Obama and Trump and Harper and Trudeau and liberal and conservative politicians from around the planet who, told us that this is the man who's going to help us fight the drug trade in Central America and help us raise Central Americans out of poverty so that they're not forced to migrate north.
But in reality,
he was basically running a drug cartel, working hand in hand with the Cachiros, one of the most notorious drug cartels in Honduras. He also started his own Praetorian Guard called the Military Police that answered directly to him, completely doing away with the separation of powers that exists in anything that should call itself a republic. You shouldn't have an internal police force that responds directly to the executive.
Human rights activist Karen Spring lived in Honduras throughout Hernández's government.
He was able to traffic, thousands of kilos of cocaine into the United States because he'd consolidated all this power under this political dictatorship. But really, he was also using it not only for political economic power, which, as a dictator, you control the economic, structures of the state. But he was also using it to, pocket a significant amount of money using the drug trade to do it. So that's another sort of interesting component of the dictatorship, and that's why people call Juan Orlando Hernández a narco-dictatorship or a narco-dictator.
On the ground, the repression only got worse. During the 2009 coup and throughout the subsequent coup governments, two important social movements joined the resistance on the streets. Ofrané, the black fraternal organization of Honduras, which defended the rights of the Afro-Indigenous Garifuna people on the Caribbean coast, and COPIN, the Council of Popular and Indigenous Organizations of Honduras. Their organizing and vocal resistance was key from day one. At the head of COPIN was Berta Cáceres, one of the most outspoken and powerful grassroots environmental, feminist, and indigenous leaders in the country. That's her, speaking about the role that the Obama administration, and in particular Hillary Clinton, played in the 2009 coup. Graham Russell had known Berta Cáceres since the late 90s. His organization, Rights Action, supported her work for years.
She would speak at all levels in the most comfortable, clear, and direct way. And she had a very funny sense of humor. So I think you combine her charisma and her capacity to educate and empower people with her broad vision. And she was already one of the most amazing, if not the most amazing, sort of community leader, sort of revolutionary leader that I'd met and come across in my work before 2009. And then the role of cocaine and Ofrene sort of exploded on the national and much more into the international scene after the 2009 in opposition to the US and Canadian-backed coup.
In 2015, she won the prestigious Goldman Environmental Prize for her and Copin's grassroots campaign against the Agua Zarca Dam.
Debemos sacudir. La madre tierra.
We must answer the call, she said in her award acceptance speech. Our Mother Earth, militarized, fenced in, poisoned, where basic rights are systematically violated, demands that we take action. Ten months later, March 2nd, 2016. Gunmen assassinate Berta in her home. Her death sends shockwaves not just throughout Honduras, but around the globe.
Songs of Sorrow. It's how the indigenous Lenca people pay tribute to Berta Cáceres, the activist who fought to protect them and the environment.
¡Berta vive!
Members of Copin occupy the country's Attorney General's office. They demand answers about the murder of Berta Cáceres and accountability for those responsible. They're met with repression. They are still demanding justice. Exactly 2 months after her death, May 2nd, 2016.
Justamente ese día, una entrevista.
Journalist Felix Molina interviews one of Berta Cáceres' daughters for his radio show Resistencias. Remember, we heard about his show Resistencias in part 1 of this episode. Just a few hours later, 7 p.m., Felix is riding in a taxi, stopped at a traffic light when armed gunmen attack. It's the second attempt on his life that day.
Ya directo contra mi persona, ya no pude escaparme.
This time, I wasn't able to escape from the vehicle I was in, he says. The light was red. There were too many other cars. He's shot 4 times. He's rushed to the hospital. The news shocks the country. Berto Oliva, from the Committee of Family Members of the Detained and Disappeared, speaks out the next day. May 3rd, Press Freedom Day.
Se da cuenta, hoy es el Día Mundial de la Libertad de Prensa.
Today is International World Press Freedom Day, she says, and this is a journalist with recognized merits. And with this attack, the powerful have sent a message to the world, a message that they will silence, block, violate, and run over anyone who does not follow their line. And we believe that the countries that are advancing in democracy should not have just one way of thinking, she says. Felix survives. He's transferred from one hospital to another.
Pasé por 2 hospitales.
I went through 2 hospitals and still had to continue healing my wounds in Nicaragua before traveling to the United States, he says. He would make his way to Canada, where, concerned for his life, he would request asylum.
Reconocer una demanda de asilo.
He says this was really hard for him to do. He had spent years with his radio show intentionally sharing positive stories, refusing to let the fear in.
Porque yo tenía la dificultad de reconocer.
I didn't want to believe that it was dangerous for me to return to Honduras, he says. He says he also didn't want to leave everything he had built behind.
Relaciones, vínculos sociales.
Relationships, social ties, connections, family, he says. The process of change that had fought for years and which I had accompanied with my convictions and principles. Felix Molina was granted asylum in Canada. He hasn't returned to Honduras since. And he was not the only one forced to flee.
And we turn now to Honduras, where experts believe that the flow of the tens of thousands of minors looking to cross into the United States is unlikely to decrease.
That was 2014. The migration of thousands of unaccompanied minors to the United States was front-page news in the United States. This was not a coincidence. It was a direct result of the 2009 Honduran US-backed coup and the fallout that came from it. You might remember we looked at this in depth in the first episode of this podcast, Monroe and Migration. U.S. intervention in the form of wars, invasions, coups, sanctions, and support for authoritarian regimes is ironically the root cause of the waves of people fleeing their countries and heading to the United States. Honduras is a perfect example. Arturo J. Vizcarra is an asylum attorney who's worked with migrants in Mexico for the last 5 years. We spoke with him in episode 1. He's seen the migration crisis from the ground, and he says the 2009 coup and its aftermath has been the top cause of people migrating from Central America over the last 2 decades.
You see the growing and sometimes exponentially outflow of people from Honduras over the next 10 years. Since I've been in Mexico for the last 5 years, as far as Central Americans are concerned, Hondurans are far and away the biggest population out of Central America. You really do see this explosion since the coup.
Remember the Hondurans on the road north that I introduced you to in episode 1? Like Maria, who traveled with her 2 boys?
Porque mi vida corre peligro.
My life is in danger, she told me, in the Mexican border town of Tapachula, in a park where she camped with other migrants. I've denounced it with the police, but they're waiting to kill me. My children are in danger, and that's why I left Honduras. Violence is the main reason why people fled. In the years following the 2009 coup, Honduras topped the list of the world's countries with the highest murder rate. And it would get even worse, as another round of fraudulent elections and state violence would push Hondurans to flee in unprecedented numbers, a mass exodus of migrants traveling in caravans toward the United States. That in a minute.
Hey everyone, Maximilian Alvarez here, editor-in-chief of the Real News Network. We're going to get you right back to the program in a sec, I promise, but really quick, I just wanted to remind y'all that The Real News is an independent, viewer and listener-supported grassroots media network. We don't take corporate cash, we don't have ads, and we never ever put our reporting behind paywalls. But we cannot continue to do this work without your support. It takes a lot of time, energy, and money to produce powerful, unique, and journalistically rigorous shows like Under the Shadow. So if you want more vital storytelling and reporting like this, we need you to become a supporter of The Real News now. Just head over to therealnews.com/donate and donate today. It really makes a difference. Also, if you're enjoying Under the Shadow, then you will definitely want to follow NACLA, the North American Congress on Latin America. NACLA's reporting and analysis goes beyond the headlines to help you understand what's happening in Latin America and the Caribbean from a progressive perspective. Visit NACLA.org to learn more. That's NACLA.org. All right, thanks for listening. Back to the show.
It is 2016. Berta Cáceres is dead. Felix Molina is exiled. Narco-dictator Juan Orlando Hernandez has cracked down on his opposition. He controls all branches of government, perhaps most importantly the Supreme Court. That body has already cleared his way to run for re-election, even though the Constitution prohibits it. By the end of 2016, the Electoral Authority officially allows him to put his hat in the ring. Now, I want to pause here to underscore this point, because it is the epitome of hypocrisy. Remember, as we learned in the beginning of part 1 of this episode, running for re-election in Honduras is illegal under the Constitution. In fact, it is the very excuse Congress, the Supreme Court, and the military used to justify removing President Manuel Zelaya from power in 2009. And yet, less than a decade later, that is exactly what Juan Orlando Hernandez does. He decides to run for re-election, and since he's stacked every branch of government with his political allies, the courts give him the green light. These are new times, he says in December 2016, upon signing up to run. This is a new era. What doesn't change is that the Honduran people will decide. Well, not really. See, Hernandez was actually behind in the polls leading up to the 2017 election. In fact, he was trailing Libre, the party formed out of the resistance movement. Hernandez does return to power, but it's not because that's what the people decide. He steals the election through blatant fraud, and the aftermath is really reminiscent of the 2009 coup. Mass protests, military curfew, brutal repression, killings. Now, I want to dive into this specific moment really quick, because it shows the lengths that the US, with the support from Canada, will go to back a corrupt and fraudulent ally even in the present day. I mean, this wasn't the 1950s or even the 1980s. This was just a few years ago. Alex Main's CEPR analyzed the 2017 vote count and detailed how the fraud robbed the opposition of a win.
When the elections took place, the results that were coming in showed them winning by a significant margin of over 5 points. And then suddenly there was an interruption. All sorts of technical difficulties that took place in the counting of the votes. And for something like 30 hours, there was no more news. And then finally, when they began to announce results again, the results started heading in a very different direction. They shifted very drastically in favor of the incumbent, Juan Rolando Hernandez, and in a way that was really quite unexplainable. Understandably, Hondurans were extremely skeptical. In fact, they were very quick to reject the results. Tens of thousands of Hondurans took to the streets when final results announcing the victory of Juan Rolando Hernandez came out. There were enormous protests. Those protests were very violently repressed with live ammunition. And you had dozens that were killed. So the country was rather unstable for a while, but the US sort of very quickly came in and said, you have to respect the results.
Canada immediately followed suit, recognizing the results and Hernandez's re-election. Rights Action's Graham Russell.
Honduras had 3 sets of violent, corrupt, anti-democratic elections. 2009, 2013, 2017. That's the playbook. And all 3 sets of elections were absolutely condemned internationally, Latin America-wide, blah, 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 denounced nationally. And the US and Canada every single time approved them formally because we were hiding behind the fig leaf of our democratic ally.
In June 2023, I sat down with human rights defender Karen Spring at a mall in Tegucigalpa. We sat on a deck just outside the food court as the sun sank in the sky and the people and traffic bustled around us.
Being here for the last 13 or 14 years, there is nothing that happens in this country that the United States government, through the U.S. Embassy in Tegucigalpa, doesn't know about and isn't involved in, especially a coup to that level. And I saw it again in 2017 with the illegal re-election of Juan Rolando Hernandez.
Karen saw it firsthand. Her partner was a well-known figure in the resistance movement going back to 2009. In the violent government crackdown following the fraudulent vote in 2017, more than 1,000 people were rounded up. He was one of them. He was falsely charged of arson and locked up without trial in a maximum security prison alongside convicted gang members and murderers. She says this was a government tactic that was commonly used to try to silence political prisoners and scare movement leaders.
When I was trying to get my partner out of prison, after the 2017 electoral crisis, I would go to all of the embassies in the country, and all of the embassies asked me, almost the first thing they asked me was, have you gone to the U.S. embassy yet? Because they have a much bigger staff than we do. And it was their way of saying, we don't really call the shots here. It's the U.S. government. And that is very, very clear in Central America, I think, and particularly in Honduras, and it always has been.
Alex Main.
Really, at no point did the U.S. raise serious concern about the enormous human rights violations that took place. Basically a massacre of protesters, You had many protesters that ended up going into hiding, others that went into exile. It was a very gloomy time for Honduras and for Honduran democracy. And yet the US was there standing behind these extremely flawed election results because the logic remained the same. This government had to be supported because the status quo in Honduras had to be supported. The US could not allow an independent government, a government that would chart, an independent foreign policy course, an independent domestic policy course. This was just something that the US could not allow in a country like Honduras, where it has exercised control for such a very long time.
The first group of around 3,000 Honduran migrants who want to get into the United States has arrived at the border between Guatemala and Mexico. President Trump has threatened to cut U.S. aid to Central American countries that fail to stop the caravan.
Months after the 2017 elections, thousands of Hondurans joined massive migrant caravans traveling from Central America to the United States. Many cite violence, repression, and the corrupt Hernandez government among their reasons for fleeing. Immigrant lawyer Arturo J. Vizcarra accompanied these caravans.
Some of those migrants were actually very politicized, very much saw themselves as fleeing the Honduran regime, which was, just a continuation of the 2009 coup regime, even though this is 8 years later.
He says the numbers of people fleeing Honduras would skyrocket in the subsequent years and remain high until today.
Hondurans are still usually the number one Central American population that is going through. So apart from the political stuff, there's obviously the violence of the state, the violence of criminal organizations, in this case, the gangs, and of course, economic violence and inequality.
But Hernandez would not last.
To an election that could have major implications for both immigration and the war on drugs. On Sunday in Honduras, millions will be heading to the polls to choose their next president.
Hernandez's narco regime had become too unstable, too corrupt even for the United States and its allies, and the opposition was too great. In the 2021 election, the candidate chosen to succeed Hernandez and run under his party's ticket lost to none other than Libre Party candidate Xiomara Castro, the wife of Manuel Zelaya. She won by nearly 20 points.
Celebrations in the Honduran capital, Tegucigalpa.
People rejoiced across the country. The story had come full circle. Today in Tegucigalpa, you still see graffiti painted across the city that reads Fuera Ho, get out J-O-H. That's the Honduran shorthand for former President Juan Orlando Hernandez. And his story is playing out right now in New York's Southern District Court.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today, Juan Orlando Hernandez, the former president of Honduras, was extradited to the United States to face federal charges.
In April 2022, 3 months after leaving office, Hernandez was indicted on drug trafficking charges and extradited to the United States. He's been in jail ever since. The highly publicized trial against him began in February 2024. Prosecutors accuse him of running a, quote, corrupt and violent drug trafficking conspiracy. He's not the only one. His brother, former Congressman Tony Hernandez, is already serving a life sentence in the United States for drug trafficking. His former chief of police, Juan Carlos Bonilla, has pled guilty in the United States for drug trafficking. The son of former President Pepe Lobo, whose fraudulent 2009 election consolidated the coup regime, is also serving decades in the U.S. for drug trafficking. But here's the thing. It's not like the U.S. didn't know what was going on throughout the entire time that they adamantly supported the post-2009 coup governments. Anthropologist Adrienne Pine.
What is getting excluded from the narrative in these very important trials is the enormous role of the United States and Canada. It's important in that they're highlighting how violent and the extent of the narco-dictatorship, but they're also letting the US and Canada off the hook. And so it's important to always be reminding ourselves that Juan Orlando Hernandez could not have become the narco-dictator of Honduras without the gung-ho support of Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State during the coup, and without the firm support of the Obama administration and subsequent administrations, Democrat and Republican, who likewise celebrated these narco-dictators as being their greatest ally and the allies in the war on drugs.
Hi, everybody. I'm live outside the Southern District Court of New York.
Karen Spring has been in the courtroom in New York City covering the trials since they began in February.
So as this trial is unfolding here in New York, we are having the discussion about the big elephant in the courtroom, which is the role of the U.S. and Canada in propping up what U.S. prosecutors say is a deadly drug trafficker for so many years.
On Friday, March 8th, a New York court convicted Hernandez of conspiring with drug traffickers to send hundreds of tons of cocaine to the United States in exchange for hefty bribes. Assistant U.S. Attorney Jacob Gutwillig told the court that Hernandez had, quote, paved a cocaine superhighway to the United States. When I met Karen Spring in Tegucigalpa in 2023, I asked her about Hernandez's extradition to the U.S. and his then upcoming trial.
It's just so important to remember that the United States doesn't have friends, they have interests, right? And so, like, as soon as a leader no longer serves their interests, which progressive leaders never will, so it's like, let's use these tactics like lawfare to lock them up. But it's like, okay, how do you get Juan Orlando Hernandez out of the picture? Which I think it's like a revenge. It's a revenge tactic against Juan Orlando Hernandez, why they have him in prison in the U.S. I don't think they really give a shit about drugs going into the U.S. I mean, they certainly don't care about any of the corruption that he was involved in, except, the drugs maybe. Now that he's in the U.S., they all of a sudden care. But they look the other way on so many other issues. And so it's also like Juan Orlando Hernandez should be facing trial here for all the worst crimes he committed. Drug trafficking is like, sure, it's bad, I guess, but he killed so many people. He left the state in an economic situation of complete, helplessness. Like, they don't have any money for any social programs. They're still trying to figure out just what the hell happened.
Powerful individuals connected to the Hernandez dictatorships are still entrenched in government. And though Libre and Xiomara Castro now control the executive branch, Honduras still has a long road ahead when it comes to undoing the damage of the U.S.-backed coup and dictatorship.
We're really waking up to oh my God, look at the state of affairs that they've left this state in, this government. I mean, some institutions will say, especially related to the Zedes, they will say, we don't even know the contracts that were signed with foreign companies. We don't even have that paperwork.
The Zedes are these private cities that the narco regime approved and promoted. They've now been rolled back, but at least one is still fighting the Honduran government and demanding more than $10 billion in alleged lost profits through international arbitration.
And we're still trying to understand what the coup meant in Honduras, and a lot of the things that the government's trying to get out right now and trying to turn back, like the privatization, but also reveal to the population about what they're dealing with is part of understanding what the coup meant. So the coup happened in 2009, but you can't really talk about present-day Honduras and not talk about the coup.
Karen says Xiomara Castro's government has been trying to dig the country out of the abyss it was plunged into by successive coup regimes. It's pushed for greater labor protections, tried to renegotiate energy contracts and a progressive tax system. But they've been hounded by conservative elites and U.S. Ambassador Laura Dogu.
No, mire, la situación política aquí en este momento es difícil.
That's her, criticizing Castro's government late last year. Confidence in the government institutions has weakened at a time when you need greater confidence in the institutions, she told a group of journalists.
She's been making very clear statements to the press against these reforms, and that's sort of how you gauge that the U.S. is not happy with them. So there's like really direct statements and interventions that the U.S. is going about, but also then there's a lot of like indirect and like quiet, interventions. And this is like, a strategy they've used for decades and decades in Central America and all around Latin America and the world.
In other words, in Honduras, the U.S. was willing to withdraw its support from the Hernandez narco regime. It would allow fair elections to occur that would see Xiomara Castro come to power, but it has remained vocal about ensuring that Castro's government does not step too far out of line.
They're not interested in addressing the root causes of migration at all. And I think that that's something else the ambassador has said very clearly here in Honduras, is that I'm here to promote the economic interests of the United States.
Alex Main.
And I think they believed, and probably continue to believe, that they can still exercise a sufficient amount of control over the politics of Honduras due to the enormous economic leverage that the U.S. has, and to the fact that the U.S. still has such very tight relations with the Honduran armed forces, who, as we saw in 2009, can act independently from the head of state of the country.
So there's something I want to underscore here that's really important. And I need to touch on this here because, as I've mentioned, this is the only episode of Under the Shadow that deals with U.S. intervention in the present. In the beginning of this series, I traveled to Guatemala, where the CIA actively participated in a violent coup that overthrew the country's democratically elected government in 1954. We've looked at enthusiastic U.S. support for bloody authoritarian regimes in the 1980s. Later in this series, I'll take you to Panama to look at the impact of the last large-scale U.S. invasion in Latin America. That was 1989. Alex Main.
We haven't seen the sort of military intervention that was more common in the past. The Marines would arrive, they'd occupy a country for a while, they'd kind of reshape the politics, they'd reshape the security apparatus and eventually leave. Not so much of that, but there are a lot of other insidious ways that the U.S. has been very involved in shaping the politics of the region. They've kind of ramped up their efforts since this progressive wave came to power in Latin America in the late 90s, early 2000s, as a result of a sort of broader democratization of the region that really started in the late 80s and early 90s.
Se declara culpable al acusado Fernando Armindo Lugo Méndez.
The U.S.-backed coups in the region since then have been more subtle, done under the pretext of supposedly holding up the rule of law and democracy while actually undermining it. They're not as cut and dry, more confusing, easier to whitewash, easier to spin and garner international support. The 2009 coup in Honduras is a perfect example of this. Congress and the Supreme Court joined forces with the military to claim that Manuel Zelaya was threatening the Honduran constitution. They removed him within a few hours, took power, and in the words of human rights defender Berto Oliva in the beginning of the last episode, rolled the country back 50 years. And we've seen this model implemented time and again up and down the hemisphere.
61 votos sim. Está cassado o mandato da presidente Dilma Rousseff.
The 2012 coup against President Fernando Lugo in Paraguay. The 2016 congressional coup against Dilma Rousseff in Brazil. The 2019 coup against Evo Morales in Bolivia. In each case, you have Congress or the Supreme Court that maybe aligns with the military or the police to oust the democratically elected leader for supposedly breaking the laws of the nation or attacking the country's constitution. Those behind the coup paint themselves as the arbiters of true justice and the supposed defenders of, quote, democracy, all while employing undemocratic methods to take and hold power. The other model for the modern coup? Build vocal opposition movement, generate violence in the streets, sow confusion, blame, and remove the president. That's what we saw in the 2002 48-hour coup against Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez and the 2004 coup against President Jean-Bertrand Aristide. In all of these cases, the United States is quick to recognize the new regime. Canada is often not far behind. The new leaders then proceed to gut the nation's institutions, roll back any progressive reforms, and auction off the country's assets and resources to foreign corporate interests as quickly as possible. COFADE's Berto Oliva. Here in Honduras, they tried to paint it as a presidential succession and not a coup, she says. They even had a congressman falsify the signature of President Zelaya to make it appear as though he had resigned. What they didn't count on was the strength of those in the streets, because they would not stop. They denounced it and called it a coup. When I was writing the first part of this episode, I went back and looked at some of my pictures from the summit of the Bolivarian Alliance for the Americas that I reported on in Venezuela in 2009. There's this one photo. The country's presidents are standing outside in a semicircle. They're all waving, happy. Manuel Zelaya was there. When I saw the picture, I realized something. Of the 8 progressive leaders in attendance in that picture, 3 of them would be removed from office in coup d'etats over the next decade, and 1 would be dead, Hugo Chavez. In other words, we think of U.S.-backed coups as a thing of the past, but they aren't. They're as present today as they ever were. It's just the model that's different, the way they're carried out. The end result is the same. Berta Oliva told me something when I visited her in 2023 that really stuck with me.
Somos sobrevivientes de la política de los 80, de la doctrina de seguridad nacional.
We are the survivors of the politics of the 1980s, of the doctrine of national security, where the neoliberal project began, she said. And we're also the survivors of this new era of tragedy, of pain, and absolute control of the state. Now, we have to pick up the pieces of the country that are left.
No sé hasta cuánto vamos a aguantar o cuánto va a costar.
I don't know how long it'll take us, but we have the good intention, she said. It is truly needed, because if not, Honduras will be lost. And people are doing just that, picking up the pieces. Felix Molina.
Yo creo que el primer legado de la resistencia.
I believe that the top legacy of the resistance to the coup is about having eliminated the shyness that existed between social movements and political movements, he says, in order to access state power through a party. People are also honoring the past and building for the future. On March 2nd, 2024, hundreds of people joined members of the indigenous grassroots organization Copín in La Esperanza, Honduras, to remember Berta Cáceres on the 8th anniversary of her killing. Singer, journalist, activist Carla Lara was there.
Y bueno, pues ahí estuvimos.
We were there, and so was Berta, says Carla, in 1,000 forms, in the fire, in the altars, in the words of the people, in the Lenca people with their excellent food, sharing with respect for diversity and difference, with so much music, so much spirituality, with so much of her, even after 8 years. Graham Russell says Berta was an extraordinary loss.
Because of who she was and who she remains being for so many, as they say in Honduras, and now they say internationally, Berta sí murió, pero se multiplicó. Yes, she did die, she was killed, but she multiplied. And her message is now being shared on a regular basis inside Honduras, throughout the Copín world, the Lenca world, and around the world. The example of who she is and what she fought for.
Tú también, oh mi patria, te alzas de tus sueños servil profundo.
All along, the US and Canada knew exactly who we were supporting in Honduras, and we lied about it. And Berta was clearly assassinated by the US and Canadian-backed regime.
That is all for this episode of Under the Shadow. In the next episode, we head to Nicaragua, but far into the past, to the 1800s, to another regime that was enthusiastically backed by the United States, this one stolen from Nicaraguans and implanted by U.S. filibuster William Walker in one of the most twisted stories of U.S. imperialism in Central America. I'll take you there next time on Under the Shadow. Let me just say before I go that we are now well over halfway into the series. We've traveled from Guatemala to El Salvador and Honduras. In the coming months, as we work our way south, we'll be visiting Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama. As always, walking from the past into the present, deciphering the legacies today and the shadow hanging over the region. The shadow of the United States, the shadow of the Monroe Doctrine. As always, if you like what you hear, please check out my Patreon page, patreon.com/MFOX. There you can also support my work, become a monthly sustainer, or sign up to stay abreast of all the latest on this podcast and my other reporting across Latin America. Under the Shadow is a co-production in partnership with The Real News and NACLA. The theme music is by my band Monte Perdido. This is Michael Fox. Many thanks. See you next time.
Thank you so much for watching The Real News Network, where we lift up the voices, stories, and struggles that you care about most. And we need your help to keep doing this work, so please tap your screen now, subscribe, and donate to The Real News Network. Solidarity forever.